Welcome to Polarized Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on US and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Today, Polaris Live begins its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global readership for your confidence in our unbiased coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. My guest today is the Charles and Elfriede Collis Professor of History at Dartmouth College. She is a specialist on the Qing Dynasty and modern Chinese history. Author of 8 books, including China's Global Empire, Qing, 1636 to 1912, Hammer and Anvil, Nomad Rulers of the Forge of the Modern World. Her written commentary has appeared in popular publications, including Foreign Policy, China File, the London Review of Books, etc. Please welcome Dr. Pamela Crossley. Good morning, Pamela. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Hope you're well.
I'm well too, thank you. Fascinating subject, Qing Dynasty and America's relationship. So, Dr. Crossley, you make the point that America's relationship with China was literally built during the 2 centuries of the Qing Dynasty. That's a long time. Given today's seemingly permanent tense nature of US-China relations, does the Qing period offer any suggestions on how the 2 superpowers should handle these rough times?
Well, suggestions is a little bit of a complicated idea because you'd have to believe, which I don't quite, that the past actually predicts the future in some way. But what it does do is it provides a sense of perspective, which I think would actually be helpful in light of understanding some of the more topical issues. So I think it always helps to understand where things come from. And particularly in the case of the United States and China, that the relationship is very, very old and has many dimensions to it and is basically a durable one.
Well, it does seem to me, even though you can't transpose everything from then to now, but the 2 countries must have gone through ups and downs, right? There must have been blips on the horizon, and somehow, I guess, they found a way to jump over the blips, maybe in a short time, maybe in a longer time. Can you talk about that a bit? Because we don't seem to be getting off dead center these days.
Right. I know today we're mostly going to talk about the Qing period, but really I would just say, by way of opening this up, that in the entire period from initiation of U.S. relations with China to now, there is this 30-year blip, right, from the sort of 50s to the, let's say, about 1980, that U.S. and China were really not in direct contact and appeared to be irremediably hostile. But other than that, it's really been one of the U.S.'s most, as I say, long-lived and in some ways flexible relationships. There's like 2 tracks to it, right? One is the economic and the business side, which I know you're very interested in. And then the other is the political side, particularly the public political side, which is itself sort of a subset of the whole political side. So there have been some continuities and discontinuities, and sometimes there's not complete agreement in the trajectory of these 2 paths, but they've always been there since the beginning.
But do you think that, or do we know that business between the 2 has acted as a way to get over the political tiffs? Is there any evidence of that? Because that was a big deal, right? Business between the 2.
Yeah, I think it's a stabilizer Certainly. I mean, just think of the amount of pressure from the corporate world to reopen relations with China, right? And then all through the 70s, keeping that on track.
Right.
That the United States knew they were a little bit behind at that point in relation to, let's say, Japan and what was then West Germany. And so that sort of economic side of it had this kind of stabilizing effect, stabilizing in the sense of bringing it back to what were really the more normal relations between the United States and China since the 18th century.
But do you think, I was thinking this morning, I wonder if technology has anything to do with where we are versus the Qing Empire. I mean, right now, if something happened, it would be all over the internet. It would be all over the papers. Then it took time to find out if there was a blip and what the blip meant and so on. Do you think modern technology and communications comes in the way as it didn't then?
It's certainly it's a factor, and particularly in decision making, right? So actually, when you go back to these events of the very late 18th and then all the way through the 19th century, the speed with which events like this became part of public commentary is really you note that when you go through it, but the physical speed of communications, particularly before the middle of the 19th century, was slow, and so it affected decision making in the sense that the individuals on the scene, right, whether they were the Qing officials, the local officials, like in Guangzhou, like Canton, or the plenipotentiaries that were sent by Britain in particular, and then subsequently the United States, they had to sort of they had general guidelines, and then they had to make their own decisions. And you could have things happen like the first Opium War, for instance, that it's really, you don't look to Beijing or London to try to figure out how some of those things happen. You have to look right at the local scene and the two representatives who are on hand, because they have the discretion to make some decisions. And if it goes wrong, very bad for them. But in the meantime, this has to do with the speed of communications. But the role of public discourse, right. Is remarkably potent, and I think people manage to keep themselves au courant, just given the fact that in the 18th century there was a gap of months between knowledge what was happening in, say, let's Hong Kong, or Guangzhou, and what was happening in London, and weeks between Guangzhou and Beijing. So that is different, obviously. It probably facilitates more decision-making from the center.
So this sounds like the right time to bring up this recent flight of a Chinese balloon over Canada and a large swathe of the US, Pamela, right? And just before the Secretary of State Blinken was headed to Beijing for talks with President Xi Jinping. How does this happen? I mean, Xi Jinping is supposed to be the most powerful leader of China since Mao Zedong. And if he really doesn't want to scupper these talks, how does something like this happen? Isn't he supposed to control all of China?
Well, these governments are very big and complex. I mean, it's like asking how could it have happened in the past, and large sectors of the US government didn't know anything about it. There is compartmentalization within each of these governments. And I think when it comes to these balloons, I mean, obviously there's a unit, right, within the PLA that does that. They probably have their schedule, they have their programs. They've done this previously in the past, probably with slightly different balloons that didn't seem to have any untoward effects. So they probably it was time for them to launch another one. They did it. They have no reason to ask Xi Jinping, is that okay? Especially, how does he know it's going to go off course if in fact that's what happened? Or how does he even know exactly where it is going to go? This is, we still have a problem between the center and the peripheries. Now it's not so much space and time, it's just these kind of layers of organization that get in the way. or what are they calling this in the U.S. now? A domain, a gap. There's are many domains in the Chinese government. So I think it's not so much a question of how it happened. These things do happen. It's the way it's handled afterwards that is probably the key.
I have a follow-up question for you, but before that, I want to ask our audience whether they think China should have apologized for the balloon's flight over the US. As you know, Pamela, we've now added polling capabilities with real-time updating for our subscribers. And after the program, they can go log into polarizedlive.com, click the community tab on the top of the screen and vote. And boy, we'd love to hear from you, whether you think China should have apologized when this first came out. And now back to Dr. Pamela Crossley from Dartmouth College. And I have a question to you about something you mentioned to me in a conversation a few days ago. You said, the Opium War, which let me remind our audience, was fought between the West and China to pretty much make sure that opium got through to China. Opium was banned under China law. And you pointed out to me that even though opium was banned under Chinese law, they didn't really enforce that ban or that law. And you mentioned, therefore, the West might be right in thinking that this was neutralized. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there are reports that there were other balloons during the Trump time and perhaps even before, and because America didn't enforce boundaries, that maybe the Chinese said, hey, that law doesn't really apply. They don't care about it.
Yeah, the Opium War, the first Opium War, 1839 to 1842, it was fought between Britain and China, not the West and China, right? And in fact, all through the 19th century, there was a real kind of disparity and sometimes a tension between the approach of the United States and the approach of Britain. And actually, obviously, that was true of France too. So yeah, it was fought over. I mean, the war was fought over several issues, most of them all having to do with law. Opium wasn't even legalized in the treaty that resulted. So opium, has a sort of complicated relationship to what we call the Opium War, and was called the China War at the time by Britain. This idea of whether you enforce the law or not, it was a claim made by the British government and segments of the British press. And I think the issue is slightly murky because the laws in Qing China against opium were very old, and they probably had been enforced from time to time. What the British were arguing was that they'd never been enforced with respect to them. Therefore, in effect, the law was nullified. It wasn't a real law. And yeah, I think, there's, I don't know how much of international law governs having balloons float over other people's countries. There is such a thing as airspace. And sure, I think if you're down there in the units down in the PLA that are trying to handle these things, and you find that, well, we did this a few times and nobody said anything about it, so must be okay. It's reasonable, right? If it doesn't turn out the way you're expecting, then that can happen too. But there is this question of enforcement and consistency. And I think this is actually one of the things that's being acknowledged by the Biden administration, that we just have to be simple and open and consistent about this. And then that's just it. There's no, other than that, you don't make a big deal about it. I think that's a very, very productive way to approach it. But yeah, you get away with things and you think, well, this is probably okay. That's human.
So another point I want to clarify, a number of authorities in China especially point out that China is a civilizational empire, civilizational country, meaning that they are 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So you cannot really understand their laws and traditions and so on until you take all of that into account. So they point out that if Europe had come together, all the countries, and become one country, that would be a civilizational equivalent of where China is now. So if you follow that logic, shouldn't what the Qing Dynasty, if you follow that logic, shouldn't whatever happened in the Qing Dynasty, laws and so on, carry over to today? Do you believe in the civilizational idea of China?
I mean, I would have to test that in a whole lot of ways. I mean, that doesn't, it seems a bit condescending, right? I mean, China is able to follow the law just like anybody else. The United States is. When the United States breaks a law, we could invoke a civilizational argument. In fact, China regularly refers to the United States as the West. When you ask them who's the West, they always say the United States. They must think there's some kind of civilizational thing there too. That doesn't, change the responsibility of the United States to follow law and to be called out when they don't follow the law. So I don't, and I have to say, at the time of the Opium War, that wasn't an argument being made in Britain. There was plenty of people, there was a huge portion of the public, and in fact of the government, that was opposed to the opium trade, and their argument was a legal one and a moral one. It didn't have anything to do with civilizational stuff.
Right. So there's some. So we can give a little bit on that, but not very much, actually, is what you're saying. So I want to go back to this idea of the relationship, the length of the relationship during the Qing Dynasty. And I want to come tangent to my recent report for the Foreign Policy Association, in which I suggest that over the last 3 decades, politicians in China and the US have, for whatever reason, failed to soften the dangerously tense relations between the two superpowers. But the business community in both countries have made enormous strides. And in fact, both on the Chinese and the American side, there have been compromises which everybody thought could not be made. So my question is, and this is what I'm trying to bring out in my reporting now, is why not let the business leaders take the leadership role and let the politicians kind of step back a bit and let things proceed, and let's see if that helps to cool this strategy. A strategy to cool temperatures. And I wonder, second part of the question is whether the Qing Dynasty offers us any guidance.
I think the Qing period does, for sure. As I said, I see these two tracks, right, that are kind of parallel to each other, business and economy on the one side and sort of public policy, right, on the other.
Right.
It seems to me there's a whole lot of reasons why they should remain separate, even if they influence each other. But let me just go back to the Qing period, right, and talk about the framing of the early part of this relationship. Now, there's something about the current world that I think is really helpful, right, in understanding how profound this relationship is, which is today the United States is. In some years, the major producer, in others, just one of the top producers in the world of soybeans. And China is one of the top producers in the world of corn. Now, corn, as everybody knows, is an American plant, right? And in the 16th century, went to China. In the 16th and early 17th century, helped to revive parts of the Chinese agricultural sector that had actually been sort of worn away by some environmental factors. And in the 18th century, these kind of British adventurers in China brought soybeans to America before the founding of the United States. And so this is how sort of profoundly, literally at the level of the soil, China and the United States have complemented each other. that they've taken each other's crops,
Wow.
each has respectively become the major producer in the world of a crop that they got from the other, and in fact are still basing large parts of their economy on it. Now, this is how complementary these two economies, these societies have been from the beginning. And I think it's so sort of profound and durable, and I tried to make this better, that I don't think we even understand it all.
Wow.
Because I've looked for what can I read about this or that would tell me more about the complexities here, and a lot of it I still can't get good information on. So that's just an example, right, of how this has been. And again, I'm pointing to this fact that in the 19th century, the United States and let's say Britain, right, had very, very different approaches to the China trade, and attempted at some points to have different policies towards it.
Right.
Yeah. So that's. Do you want me to go on about that?
No, I actually I want to probe just a little bit more on this, because the time we are talking about was also a time of colonialism, right? This was Britain kind of viewing everything through a colonial lens, right? Once they figured out that opium was making money, then they went to their the crown jewel in their colony system, India, and started to make opium there at far less cost than it would have been made elsewhere. So do you think that this not being, I mean, colonialism's gone, so people now have to approach these issues in a whole different way. Do you think colonialism made it easier for America, or shall I say the West and China, to compromise? Because basically, the Britain said, hey, if you don't compromise, we'll come mow you down. So just asking.
Yep. I think actually probably, Britain itself was making this transition, right, from one kind of colonialism to another kind of imperialism. And the relations in China sort of come at the cusp of that, as they do with the Ottoman Empire as well. And of course, that always from the beginning distinguished the American approach from the British approach. I mean, there wasn't any Western approach, to China. So when the Opium War started and the British are starting their gunboat sort of activities in China, those were just what the United States had been subjected to, barely 2 decades before. They burnt the White House. It was, I think Americans could sort of sympathize with this a bit. They know what it's like to be on the receiving end, right, of British naval actions,
Right.
and Marines. But so I think from the beginning, to the extent that BEIC, the British East India Company, was part of this larger colonial imperialist enterprise, of course, Americans were excluded from that and had to work sort of in tension with that in starting their own China trade. One of the things that happened was it brought them much closer to some of the great Chinese merchants in Guangzhou, Haokua in particular, but not just Haokua. They had a special relationship with the Americans for 2 reasons. One, the Americans coming from outside BEIC, but second, the Americans had to pay cash for everything. Their credit wasn't good, so they were bringing lots of silver at a time when silver was very much needed. So these were personal relationships, these were business relationships, and the American relationships there were distinctive, literally from the beginning.
Distinctive compared to the British relationship?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and probably anybody else. I mean, particularly given these relationships with these home firms, the Americans just managed to create a special niche for themselves, so that when this community was being broken up in the 1830s by agitation by a certain faction of British merchants, agitating for war against China starting in the 1830s. The Americans were really not part of that because they were so close to these merchants in Guangzhou, the Chinese merchants, that they just weren't part of that, and they weren't part of the BEIC faction either.
Right, right. So as we head into the final minutes here, Pamela, I wanted to ask you about kind of an overarching question, right? The entire, at least the DNA in America has human rights and has freedom of the press and democracy as a very central energizing force, right? In China, there is the free trade, let's do business, but they don't have the same principles. They have a different principle because of their history. You know, whenever the centers become weak, they say there's always been trouble in parts of the country. So, in a sense, we have this dichotomy. We think alike on business, but we don't think alike on what the country should be governed by laws and that we do. So do you think this is bridgeable? I know this is a difficult question, but at many times I think this is at the heart of what we quarrel about. Do you think that these are bridgeable?
It's bridgeable in the sense that obviously you can, at least up to a certain point, do business with people whose political system you might not agree with. Now, some political systems will allow this and some won't. The Chinese political system has changed a lot in such a way that it's more accommodating to some of these activities.
Right.
Now, very recently, I mean, since 2013, there have been a few changes going the other way, but that happens, right? It can waver back and forth.
Right.
I think there's, the political system in China is not old. It only goes back to 1949, 1950. The way things were done in the imperial period, there wasn't any question about the center being strong, localities being weak. The center was never strong. That's not part of imperial history anywhere, right? So there's nothing, there's no civilizational anything about this. This happens. I mean, I think there were historical reasons why it was time for a very strong centralized government in China for the first time in the 19th or the 20th centuries. I think there was a moment for that, and the PRC filled it. But it's not an eternal argument for retaining such a form of government. So I think, people don't like when the United States goes around saying democracy is the best. Everybody has to do democracy. And I can completely understand that. On the other hand, everybody has the capacity to do democracy if they want to. That's their choice. Now, China, since, again, about 2014, 2015, has made it this business to go around and tell everybody that democracy is no good. It's incompetent, it's slow, it's chaotic. You need to have this so-called meritocracy thing where, you have people making all the decisions. What's the value in going around and telling people that that's much better than democracy? People could just sort of say, look, to the extent your political system is going to allow us to have a viable economic relationship, let's just do that, because that is stabilizing. And if your political system at some point should interfere with that, then we have something to discuss. Otherwise, we don't. And we don't need to go around telling people that they have to do it exactly the way we do it. And you don't need to go around telling people how your way is so much better.
Well, the Chinese like to say, who gave you the right to define democracy? We have democracy too, of a different sort. But that's a juicy conversation, which we will have to get you back to tackle, Dr. Crossley. We are unfortunately running out of time and must end this conversation. So Professor Pamela Crossley of Dartmouth College, one of the world's authorities on the Qing Empire, Chinese history. Thank you so very much for sharing your fascinating perspective on the US and China relationship today and lessons that perhaps might be drawn from the Qing Dynasty. Please come back and see us again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, I want to thank our viewers from around the world. I hope you can join us again for the next episode of Polaris Live, which will be broadcast this coming Tuesday, 14 February at 9:30 Eastern US time, when we will have a guest from Cairo who will talk about American influence in the Middle East. So thank you again so very much. Until then, goodbye.